Hello, welcome to Hidden History, an Odyssey Through Time. I'm your host, John Rodriguez, and welcome to Season 3 of the best history podcast in New York State. This is episode 30 of the podcast, and the title of this episode is For Conspicuous Gallantry, the short life of World War II Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. It has been almost 80 years since the Second World War ended, and as we continue to honor those Americans who undoubtedly and courageously contributed to the defense of the United States, we often overlook in our remembrances the valiant efforts of Black Americans. Throughout the war years, Black Americans repeatedly had to battle opponents on two fronts: the foreign enemy overseas and racism at home. In his State of the Union address on January 6, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented his reasons for American involvement in World War II, making the case for continued aid to Great Britain and greater production of war industries at home. In helping Britain, President Roosevelt stated, the United States was fighting for the universal freedoms that all people possessed. These four freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear, symbolized America's war goals and gave hope in the following years to a war-wearied people because they knew they were fighting for freedom. Now, how could Black Americans go to war and risk their lives for these four freedoms when they barely had these freedoms in the United States? Thus, as the war unfolded, they insisted on the privileges of full citizenship. Black Americans were ready to work and fight for their country, but at the same time they demanded an end to the discrimination against them. As World War II intensified in Europe, and with the U.S. Armed Forces in need of more men, President Roosevelt decided that Black American men could register for the draft, but they would remain segregated and the military would decide the number of blacks inducted into the armed forces. More than 1 million Black Americans would go on to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, and many of them would become heroes, although their stories would eventually be buried by the sands of time due to racism. In January 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, once the country's most widely circulated African American newspaper, published a letter by 26-year-old James G. Thompson, a Black American serving in the military. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? These and other questions need answering. I want to know, and I believe every colored American who is thinking wants to know. One young man who probably asked himself all of these questions and more, but still decided to serve his country, was a young man named Ruben Rivers of Oklahoma. Rivers would go on to display extreme heroism on the battlefield, which would result in his early death, but his actions would go unrecognized for many decades. It wouldn't be until January 1997 that Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was finally given the United States' highest award for military valor in action, the Medal of Honor. Ruben's story, hidden history that has remained long forgotten, is the story of an American hero willing to sacrifice his life for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen and an imperfect nation plagued by bigotry, injustice, racism, and segregation. Ruben Rivers was born October 31, 1918 in Tecumseh, Oklahoma, to Black American parents Willie Lee and Lillian Rivers. At first glance, you may think that Ruben was only Black American, but sources online, including the Oklahoma Historical Society and the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, claim that Ruben was half Cherokee, one of the largest and most well-known Native American tribes in history. Because there is currently no information available to prove otherwise, we here at Hidden History will stick with the claim that Ruben Rivers was half Cherokee. The third of 12 children, Ruben grew up in Hatoka, Oklahoma, near Earlsboro, where he and his siblings worked on the family farm. Ruben had two older siblings, Grace and Robert, and the rest were younger than him: Dewey, Bernice, Anessa, Thelma, Melvin, Lindsay Lee, Vera, May Lee, and little Willie Lee Jr. Ruben attended Dunbar High School in Shawnee, Oklahoma, which was located about 12 miles away from his home, and after graduating high school in 1938, he went to work for the local railroad. 1 year later, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland without a formal declaration of war. In support of their mutual defense treaty obligations with Poland, France and Great Britain issued ultimatums to Hitler for the immediate withdrawal of German forces from Poland. 2 days later, on September 3, 1939, having been ignored by Germany, Britain and France declared war on the Nazis. Within a month, Nazi Germany and their ally, the Soviet Union, had conquered Poland and partitioned the Polish state in half. A few months later, on April 9, 1940, Nazi forces invaded Norway and Denmark, with Denmark surrendering that day. Norway managed to hold off the Germans until early June, before Germany finally occupied the entire country. On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany began its assault on Western Europe by invading France and the neutral countries of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. By the end of May 1940, Nazi Germany had control over the three neutral countries, and on June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The armistice provided for the German occupation of the northern half of France and permitted the establishment of a collaborationist regime in the south with its seat in Vichy. France had fallen to Nazi Germany, which meant that Great Britain was the only European country left to battle the Nazis. To pave the way for an invasion of Britain, German planes bombed Britain extensively beginning in September 1940 until May 1941, known as the Blitz, including night raids on London and other industrial centers that caused heavy civilian casualties and damage. Meanwhile, in the United States, Ruben Rivers had moved on from his railroad job and relocated to Oklahoma City. It was there that he registered for the draft on October 16, 1940. Back in Europe, the British managed to hold off the Nazis, but with Britain's defensive resources pushed to the limit, Prime Minister Winston Churchill began receiving crucial aid from the United States under the Lend-Lease Act, passed by Congress in March 1941. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 stated that the U.S. government could lend or lease, rather than sell, war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Although the United States was a neutral country at the time and was not actively involved in the war, President Roosevelt began sending tanks, warplanes, food, and ammunition to Great Britain. In a nationwide radio broadcast, he asserted that the best policy for keeping the United States out of the war was to become the arsenal of democracy, extending full material support to the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply military aid to its foreign allies during World War II, while still remaining officially neutral in the conflict. Unfortunately for the United States, staying completely neutral during World War II would not be an option for the land of the free. While the United States provided material support to its allies in Europe, the enemy was up to no good on the other side of the globe. On December 7, 1941, Imperial Japanese warplanes launched a massive surprise attack against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in 2 waves, knocking out over 200 planes and sinking or damaging 8 battleships, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. A total of 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 others were wounded. Sailors, Marines, and soldiers fought back with extraordinary courage, often at the sacrifice of their own lives. Those without weapons to fight took great risks to save wounded comrades and to save their ships. Pilots took off to engage Japanese aircraft despite the overwhelming odds. Countless acts of valor went unrecorded, as many witnesses died in the attack. 15 U.S. Navy personnel were awarded the Medal of Honor, ranging from seaman to rear admiral, for acts of courage above and beyond the call of duty, 10 of them posthumously. One day after the attack by Japan, on December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke before a joint session of Congress.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense.
President Roosevelt went on to ask Congress to declare war against Japan, a declaration that was granted with just one dissenting vote. 3 days later, on December 11, 1941, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States. Later that same day, the United States formally declared that a state of war existed with Germany and Italy. The United States was now drawn into a global war. Over a month after the attack at Pearl Harbor, on January 15, 1942, 23-year-old Ruben Rivers was called to active duty in the U.S. Army. Rivers was assigned to a new all-black tank battalion at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. He arrived at the camp for training in March 1942, and it was there at Camp Claiborne that Rivers' unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, later known as the Black Panthers, was officially formed on April 1, 1942. Rivers would then be assigned to Company A of the 761st Tank Battalion. The 761st, along with the 758th Tank Battalion, another all-black unit, was housed in the camp's segregated area, about a mile away from the front gate, where the roads were rutted dirt. The men lived in moldering canvas tents next to the camp's sewage treatment area. During the training sessions, Company A Commander Captain Charles W. Calvert took note of Rivers' aptitude and promoted him to sergeant. On August 23, 1942, the 761st moved to Camp Livingston, 32 miles away, for training maneuvers. The 761st performed on par with the numerous all-white tank battalions. By early September, when they returned to Camp Claiborne, their morale was high as a result of their good showing during maneuvers. Their high morale soon faded as they endured racist taunts from the locals and many of the camp's officers. On April 8, 1943, the 761st again left for maneuvers at Camp Polk, Louisiana. They joined the 85th Infantry Division and the all-black 92nd Infantry Division for 3rd Army maneuvers. This was their most intensive training to date. They conducted combat simulations with infantry units for the first time. The maneuvers lasted for 2 months, and again, the 761st performed admirably. When they returned to Camp Claiborne in late May 1943, morale was low. The men did not feel the Army would send black troops into combat regardless of how well trained they were. On September 15, 1943, the 761st was ordered to Camp Hood, Texas. On October 29th, the 761st was reconstituted as a medium tank battalion using the M4, known as the Sherman tank, equipped with a 75mm cannon. Previously, the primary weapon for the 761st had been the M5 Stewart light tank, but the Sherman, the newest American tank, was reliable and easily repaired in the field. Ruben Rivers and the other men of the 761st were enthusiastic about this change. On June 9, 1944, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion received the news they never thought possible. They had been put on alert for deployment to the European Theater of Operations. They were going to Europe. In mid-August, the battalion spent 2 weeks at Camp Shanks in Rockland County, New York, preparing for their overseas deployment. On August 27, 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion boarded a ship in New York City for the 10-day voyage to the United Kingdom. While in the United Kingdom, the 761st was equipped with the latest version of the Sherman tank, known as the M4A3, upgraded with the 76mm cannon. They arrived in France on Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. The 761st quickly traveled 400 miles in 6 days across France to catch up with the Third Army. On November 8, 1944, Rivers and Company A, attached to the 104th Infantry, attacked and captured the town of Vic-sur-Lay, France. The next day, the force took Chateau Salins in a 4-hour fight in the season's first snowstorm, then continued east toward Morville-les-Vic. This began 183 days of continual fighting for the 761st. Hidden side note before we continue. Sometime between training sessions at Camp Claiborne and arriving in France, Ruben Rivers was promoted from sergeant to the rank of staff sergeant. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward the town of Goublin, France, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank hit a mine at a railroad crossing. Although severely wounded, his leg slashed to the bone, Staff Sergeant Rivers declined an injection of morphine and refused to be evacuated. Captain David J. Williams, the company commander, later remembered what happened when he and the rest of Company A came to aid Rivers after he was slashed to the bone. With the morphine needle in my right hand about a half an inch from Sergeant Rivers' leg, I could have told my sergeant to hold him down. I said, "Ruben, you're going back. You got $1 million wound. You're going back to Tecumseh. You're getting out of this. You got a silver star and a purple heart." He says, "Captain, you're going to need me." I said, "I'm giving you a direct order. You're going back." I said, "Medics, get the stretcher." He pushed the needle away and got up. He said, "This is one order, the only order I'll ever disobey." Allowing the medics to only clean and dress the wound, Staff Sergeant Rivers took command of another tank and advanced with his company into Goublin the next day. The next day, November 17, the Sherman tanks pushed into the town, with Rivers, still without any pain-killing morphine, leading the way. But the Germans fought back hard, forcing the American tankers and infantry to fight for every inch of ground. Rivers' Sherman engaged enemy tanks and gunners on several occasions and remained on alert the following night as the Germans, on one occasion wearing captured American uniforms, attempted to infiltrate back into the town. On November 18, Captain Williams and his medical team found Rivers and his tank still in action. Once again, the captain ordered the sergeant to be evacuated. "Captain, you know better than that," Rivers said. "This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic inspecting Rivers' swollen and infected leg looked up and shouted, "Listen, he's got gangrene." But Williams only had time to say "Ruben" before German guns again zeroed in, forcing the Americans to take cover. Captain Williams would not speak with Rivers again. Firmly against evacuation, Staff Sergeant Rivers continued to direct his tank's fire at enemy positions beyond the town through the morning of November 19, 1944. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Borgotov, their next objective, but were stopped by enemy fire. Captain David J. Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. "I see him. We'll fight him." Staff Sergeant Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on the German tanks, covering Company A soldiers as they withdrew. It was during this time that Captain Williams managed to hear the sergeant's final words on earth. "Pull up, driver! Pull back, driver! Oh, Lord!" Moments later, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank was hit and blew up, killing Ruben instantly and wounding the rest of the crew. While it is unclear how many German soldiers Ruben Rivers managed to kill before he was mortally wounded, Newspapers of the time reported that an estimated 200 Germans were killed by Rivers. Whether or not this number was exaggerated, what matters is that Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was an American hero. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was buried at Lorraine American Cemetery and Memorial in Lorraine, France. His fighting spirit and daring leadership until the end of his life were an inspiration to his unit and exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Ruben Rivers was 26 years old at the time of his death. According to the Black Dispatch, a newspaper based in Oklahoma City, a letter was sent to the parents of Ruben Rivers by Lieutenant Colonel Hollis, a front commanding officer of the tank battalion to which Staff Sergeant Rivers belonged to. The letter assured the parents that Ruben died heroically and was buried in the province of Lorraine after services had been conducted by a Protestant chaplain. After his death, Ruben Rivers was awarded a Silver Star and a Purple Heart. On November 23, 1944, Rivers' commanding officer, Captain David J. Williams, submitted the paperwork through official channels to have Rivers awarded the Medal of Honor. Williams knew it was a long shot. No African American had been awarded a Medal of Honor for World War I or World War II at that point. Williams made it his life's mission to see that Rivers was not forgotten. Memorial services were held for Ruben Rivers, sponsored by the Girl Reserve, at Dunbar High School in Shawnee, Oklahoma. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers scoured the burning streets of Berlin above his head searching for him, Adolf Hitler, dictator of Nazi Germany, took the coward's way out and killed himself deep in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery building. A few days later, on May 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. That same day, President Harry S. Truman, who had ascended to the presidency following the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, spoke to the American people through a radio broadcast.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. Let us not forget, my fellow Americans, the sorrow and the heartache which today abide in the homes of so many of our neighbors. Neighbors whose most priceless possession has been rendered as a sacrifice to redeem our liberty.
We here at Hidden History can only imagine the sorrow and the heartache that Mr. and Mrs. Rivers felt as they listened to the president's speech. Their most priceless possession, their son Ruben, has sacrificed his life to redeem our liberty. And for what? Ruben's heroic actions that led to his early death have been ignored by the U.S. government. His parents should have been presented the Medal of Honor by President Truman at the White House, and yet that never happened, simply because of the color of Ruben's skin. Moving on, after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. The biggest and deadliest war in history, involving more than 30 countries, the Second World War, had finally come to an end, but at a large cost. By the end of World War II, an estimated 60 to 80 million people had died, including up to 55 million civilians, and numerous cities in Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. Among those killed were 6 million Jews murdered in Nazi concentration camps as part of Hitler's diabolical final solution, now known as the Holocaust. The legacy of the war included the creation of the United Nations as a peacekeeping force and geopolitical rivalries that resulted in the Cold War. On August 23, 1945, high-ranking military officials and civilians gathered at the White House to watch President Harry S. Truman bestow the Medal of Honor among 28 veterans who served with valor during World War II. Family members and loved ones of the men honored that day for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, mingled with other distinguished guests while a band played outside of the East Room before the president took the stage. When he concluded the official ceremony, Truman stood to address the crowd and declared that the men who were honored loved peace and were able to adjust themselves to the needs of war and represented a cross-section of American society. But within this cross-section was a noticeable absence. No black veterans were present. Out of the more than 1 million black servicemen, not one displayed courage in action or was deserving of the honor during World War II? Or was there something else that prevented black veterans from standing among their fellow soldiers, sailors, and Marines at the White House? The Medal of Honor was never awarded to Ruben Rivers, although he deserved it. Captain David J. Williams believed the paperwork was never reviewed because Rivers was black, and no black American received the Medal of Honor during World War II. In the early 1990s, the Department of Defense started to study the issue of why no black Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor during World War II. In 1993, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, was contracted by the U.S. Army to determine if there was a racial disparity in the way Medal of Honor recipients were selected. Out of 432 Medals of Honor presented for World War II, none went to any of the more than 1 million black Americans who served. Shaw University found that there was disparity and said that the political climate and army practices during the Second World War guaranteed that no black soldier would receive the military's top award. Shaw University put together a list of 10 recommendations for the Medal of Honor, which was forwarded to a board of generals at the Pentagon. From that list, 7 black Americans who served during World War II were selected, including Ruben Rivers. On January 13, 1997, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action from November 16th to the 19th, 1944, while serving with Company A, 761st Tank Battalion. The Medal of Honor was presented to Ruben's sister, Grace Woodfork. Captain David J. Williams, who submitted the paperwork through official channels to have Rivers awarded the Medal of Honor back in 1944, was in attendance that day at the White House. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've learned something new today. Season 3 of Hidden History will explore the lives of veterans of the United States as well as veterans of foreign countries historically connected to our nation. Many of their stories have been hidden in the pages of history and deserve to be told. Pictures, newspaper clippings, and links to external articles relating to a particular episode are available on our website, hiddenhistorypod.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm John Rodriguez, and until we meet again, this has been Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time.